Madam President, I am glad that an agreement has been reached in which President Obama will finally get Senate confirmation votes on his appointees to the Consumer Financial Protection Board, the Department of Labor, and the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. This agreement, as I understand it, will also provide that the President's new nominees for the National Labor Relations Board will be rapidly confirmed. That's a step forward. But while this agreement addresses the immediate need for the President of the United States to have his cabinet and his senior staff confirmed, this agreement today only addresses one symptom of a seriously dysfunctional Senate. The issue that must now be addressed is how we create a process and a set of rules in the United States Senate which allows us to respond to the needs of the American people in a timely and effective way, something which virtually everyone agrees is not happening now. The United States Senate, in my view, cannot function with any degree of effectiveness if a supermajority of 60 votes are needed to pass virtually any piece of legislation, and if we waste huge amounts of time not debating the real issues facing working people, but waiting for quote-unquote motions to proceed hour after hour after hour where nobody is even on the floor of the United States Senate. So the good news is that I think the nation is now focused on the dysfunctionality of the United States Senate and the need for us to have rules or a process which allows us to address the enormous problems facing our country. When people ask, why is it that Congress now has a favorability rating of less than 10%, the answer is fairly obvious. The middle class of this country is disappearing. Real unemployment is somewhere around 14%. The minimum wage has not kept up with inflation. Millions of people are working in jobs which pay them poverty wages. Tens of millions of people today lack health care. While we have the most expensive and wasteful health care system in the world, the greatest planetary crisis facing our nation and the entire world is global warming. We're not even debating that issue. Now, Madam President, the United States Senate is a very peculiar institution. It is peculiar in the sense that any one member, one of 100, can come down here on the floor and utter two magical words which bring the Senate to a complete halt, and that is, I object. I will not allow the Senate to go forward, which means the whole government shuts down. I object, and what we have seen in recent years, especially since Barack Obama has been elected, is an unprecedented level of I object, of holds, of a variety of mechanisms which bring the functioning of the United States Senate to a halt. And all of this takes place at a time when millions of people can't find jobs, at a time when kids are graduating college deeply in debt, and millions of others are now choosing not to go to college because we're not addressing the issue of higher education. It takes place at a time when our infrastructure, our roads and bridges, and roads and bridges and airports and rail systems are crumbling. when our educational system is in need of major reform, when the gap between the people on top, everybody else is growing wider. The American people perceive that this country has major problems which must be addressed. And what does the United States Senate do? We are sitting here waiting 30 hours for a motion to proceed, to see if, in fact, we can vote on a piece of legislation which requires 60 votes, and time again, we don't get those votes. Now, Madam President, when votes come up, I would like to win, be on the winning side. That's natural. Everybody would. But what happens here, and the American people by and large don't fully understand it, we don't vote on issues. What happens is the debate ceases because we don't get motions to proceed. So we don't vote on a jobs program. We vote on whether or not we can proceed to a jobs program to create millions of jobs. We don't vote on whether we can keep interest rates for college students who are borrowing money low. We vote on whether we can proceed to have the vote. And what we have seen now in the last several years is an unprecedented level of obstructionism and of filibustering. Between 1917 and 1967, there was a more or less agreement in the Senate that a filibuster would only be used under exceptional circumstances. And in that 50-year period, there were only some 40, 45 filibusters in a 50-year period. When Lyndon Johnson was majority leader in the late 1950s, in his 6-year tenure as majority leader, he had to overcome a filibuster on one occasion. Since Harry Reid has been majority leader in the last 6.5 years, he has had to overcome over 400 filibusters, or at least requirements for 60 votes. The amount of time we are wasting is unconscionable. And furthermore, what the American people don't know is that time after time after time, we are winning. We have the votes to win and have shown that on very important issues. In terms of one major issue, just as an example, right now, Madam President, rather tragically, we have a situation as a result of the disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision that corporations and billionaires can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on elections. And as bad as that is, what is even worse, they can hide their contributions, not make it public. Well, guess what? The United States Senate, by a majority vote, said that's wrong. If you're going to contribute huge amounts of money into the political process, the people have a right to know who you are. We have a majority vote on that issue. We couldn't get it passed because we needed 60 votes. The American people know that our tax system is enormously flawed. That you have major corporations, General Electric and other corporations, that in a given year, after making billions of dollars in profits, pay zero in federal taxes. Legislation was passed on the floor of the Senate by majority, which begins to address that issue. But we didn't have 60 votes. We provided emergency relief to senior citizens who several years ago were getting no COLAs for Social Security. We had a majority vote, couldn't get 60 votes. We had a majority vote to say that women should be paid equal pay for equal work. Majority of senators said that. couldn't get it passed. So what we have seen in recent years is reasonably good legislation getting a majority vote, but we can't get it passed because time after time after time, we need 60 votes. So what we are operating under now is a tyranny of the minority. The American people go to vote, they elect Obama president, they elect a Democratic Senate. People who campaigned on certain issues, these people go forward trying to implement their campaign promises. They can't do it because we cannot get 60 votes. So once again, at one point in Senate history, from 1917 to 1967, the filibuster was used very, very sparingly, only under exceptional circumstances. Since that point, have Democrats, and I speak as an independent, have Democrats abused the system? Have they been obstructionists? There are times when they have been. But since 2008, what has happened is the Republicans have taken obstructionism to an entirely new level. Virtually every piece of legislation now requires 60 votes. And virtually every piece of legislation requires just an enormous amount of time. What do we do? What do we do? My colleagues on both sides of the aisle have made the point that the Senate is not the House, and they are right. In the House, there are 435 members, and majority rules. The majority has a whole lot of power. The minority just doesn't have all that much power. And people have said, we do not want the Senate to be like the House, and I agree with that. The Senate should not be the House. Senate members should be guaranteed the rights to offer amendments, not be shut out of the process. Whether you're in the minority or the majority, you should have the right to offer amendments. There should be thorough and lengthy debate. If a member of the United States Senate wants to stand here on the floor and speak hour after hour to call attention to some issue that he or she feels is important, that senator has the right, in my view, to do that. And if that debate goes on for a week, it goes on for a week. Senators, whether in the minority or the majority, have the right to call attention and to debate and to focus on issues that they consider to be important. But at the end of that debate, there must be finality. There must be a majority vote. 51 votes should win. So the concept that I support is what is called the talking filibuster. Minority rights must be protected. They must have all the time they need to make their point. But majority rights must also be protected. If democracy means anything, what I learned in the third grade was that the majority rules, not the minority. And what is happening in our country is not only enormous frustration about the very, very serious economic and environmental problems we face, there is just huge outrage at the inability of Congress to even debate those issues. For example, I am a very strong believer that the minimum wage in this country must be significantly raised. It's now about $7.25. I would like it to go up to $10 an hour. And even at $10 an hour, people working 40 hours a week will still be living in poverty. But we have got to raise the minimum wage. My strong guess is that if we don't change the rules, despite overwhelming support in this country for raising the minimum wage, we will never get an up or down vote here on that issue, because Republicans will obstruct, demand 60 votes, filibuster the issue. If my Republican friends are so confident in the points of view that they are advocating, bring them to the floor. Let's have an up or down vote. Let the American people know how I feel on the issue, how you feel on the issue. But let us not have issues decided because we couldn't get 60 votes for a quote-unquote motion to proceed. Nobody in America understands what that's about. You want to vote against the minimum wage, have the guts to come up here, vote against the minimum wage. You want to vote against women's rights, come on up here, make your say, vote against women's rights. You want to vote against global warming, vote against global warming. But let us at least have the debate that the American people are demanding. So, Madam President, let me just conclude by saying that I am glad the President will finally be able to get some key appointees seated. I was a mayor, and I know it's terribly important that if you're a chief executive, you need to have your team around you, and I'm glad that he will get some key appointees. But let us understand that what we are doing today is dealing with one very, very small part of an overall problem, which is the dysfunctionality of the United States Senate. And I hope, having addressed the immediate crisis, that we can now go on and address the broader issue, and that is making the United States Senate responsive to the needs of the American people, having serious debate on serious issues, and let's see where the chips fall.